trying to find, signals in your business as early as possible to help you make the decision. You're not looking out 5 to 10 years. You're looking at over the next really, 6 to 12 months. Most people think of Minneapolis as the cold tundra, right? But it's also the best medical device kind of ecosystems, especially for cardiovascular companies. You could have the greatest idea in the world, and it could be a phenomenal idea that serves a really impactful need, right? But if it's not one that other people are going to invest in for an eventual return, you kind of need to rethink your approach.
Hello, Scott. Thank you so much for joining me on the Health Tech Crew podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Igor. Looking forward to the conversation.
Sure. So I like to, with my guests, I like to jump right in. So you are the CEO of FastWave Medical and also a founder of a number of ventures. So in managing multiple roles, could you talk about a specific challenge you've overcome and what drives you to push forward with all those activities?
I think any startup, especially in today's sort of economic environment, right? It's all about kind of surviving and advancing, right, to the next round, so to speak. And that next round could be the next development phase. It could be the next regulatory milestone. It could be the next fundraise, so to speak, right? So I think it's best to kind of frame up that, my answer to that question under that kind of general guidance, right? Is like you're looking, and you're not looking out 5 to 10 years. You're looking at over the next really, 6 to 12 months in order to kind of get to that next sort of achievement or cross that next major hurdle, which allows you to either raise more money or hit a new revenue kind of threshold to, attract a kind of a larger swath of investors, But in terms of what keeps me motivated, I think by nature, I'm sort of biased, right, towards building, and I think just taking, like, you're always going to be putting out, fires, right? If you're involved in a startup, and it can be an absolute grind. So I think the motivation for me particularly is just really kind of, we all of us just don't have, we don't have endless time, right? And so, like, absolutely trying to make the most of your time, regardless of the challenge or regardless of kind of what you're up against, is, maximizing, the time that we're given to taking your best swing at the plate, so to speak.
So I know two engagements, and we'll talk about them today, like FastWave Medical and MedCider. Anything else you are doing right now?
Most of my like the overwhelming majority of my professional time is definitely spent on FastWave Medical, right, which is a venture-backed cardiovascular startup. We can maybe get into MedCider a little bit more detail, but it's definitely something I sort of do on the side, so to speak, right? But I'm also involved in some other startups. I'm a co-founder of another MedTech company called Crossfire Medical. I sit on the board of that one. I advise a few other startups as well. So, but FastWave by and large is the major focus of mine.
Okay, very cool. So would you say it's like 95% of your total focus, 100, like close to 100, or is it like 75?
No. It's definitely closer to 100%, right? For sure. Yeah, it takes up the majority of the waking hours of my day.
So could you give a quick summary of what is FastWave Medical and what's your story with it?
Yeah, so at a high level, we're designing and developing something called intravascular lithotripsy, or the acronym that's often used is IVL. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but for those that are listening that aren't familiar with the cardiovascular space, most of the devices that a lot of companies work on in this arena are used to sort of open up a clogged pipe, right? Which is the best analogy. And so with our particular technology, it addresses really difficult to treat calcific disease in that pipe, right? So these are blockages that historically are hard to treat with available tools, and those available tools include, balloon angioplasty, stents, something called atherectomy. And so intravascular lithotripsy or IVL is a relatively new kind of category, so to speak, where you generate shock waves, right? Ultrasonic shock waves inside an angioplasty balloon that are delivered into the vessel, the blood vessel, in order to crack or modify this difficult to treat calcium. And so that's what we're focused on at FastWave. The company is relatively new. started in early 21, raised our Series A round of capital in later that year in August of 21, and have since raised in total close to $20 million, and are on to kind of focus on our Series B round of capital to kind of get to that next sort of inflection point for the company.
And what's your kind of connection to this challenge, your personal connection and business entrepreneurial connection?
Yeah, so I would say it's a space that I've been involved with really almost since my formative years of MedTech, and so most of my career I've spent in the cardiovascular arena. So it's a domain that I know quite well, and specifically related to IVL, it's sort of an area that we've been watching for quite some time. And and I say we, it's co-founders of the company. We were tracking this space kind of back in 2020. So we're recording this in early 24. So gosh, almost the better, close to 4 years at this point now, which seems like a long time in retrospect. But we started tracking this space and decided to kind of pursue it with more rigor because of two fundamental kind of reasons. Is one, that we expected the utilization of this particular technology in IVL to increase. So that was kind of a core thesis. And then secondarily, we were actually tracking sort of some IP related activity in the space. And when there was kind of a major sort of announcement in kind of mid 2020 that caught, that was kind of our classic why now moment as a startup. And I think every startup has that moment where it's like, okay, this is the point where we should do X or do Y or pursue this with more rigor. And that IP related kind of announcement back in mid 2020 was actually the reason we as a founding team decided to pursue this project versus others. And so that led to the eventual spin out of the company in early 21. And as I mentioned, our Series A round of capital in late 2021.
You said you had a group of founders before you had the idea. So how did that happen?
Most of the folks I've known for quite some time. And so I'm now on the West Coast, but spent the previous 7 or 8 years in the Midwest, actually in Minneapolis, which for those listening that aren't familiar, most people think of Minneapolis as the cold tundra, right? But it's also the best medical device kind of ecosystems, especially for cardiovascular companies. And so I got to know a group of engineers during my time in Minneapolis, and then we've since looped in a couple other folks into kind of our team that tends to work on a lot of different ideas. One of which is FastWave.
Is it a big founder team?
No, it's relatively. I would say it's relatively small. It's a group of 5 or 6 folks. Yeah, but not all of them are involved in FastWave.
Okay, so you were kind of that's smart. You have like an internal startup kind of team that is looking for an opportunity, and then when you see one, you kind of jump on it. So yep. This is really cool. So in your overall experience, what other critical factors do you see are important for success? Even like for a lot of founders, getting to Series A would be like a significant success. So could you share some of those success factors and one factor that specifically worked well for you?
I think, and I'll frame this up kind of that's a little bit more specific to kind of capital intense startups, right? Which are going to be a lot different than maybe another startup in a different vertical where you can sort of get it off the ground with a relatively low amount of capital required. And so, specific to the former types of businesses, I think one is first kind of taking a step back and coming to a conclusion on whether or not your idea is sort of a venture, like fits within kind of a traditional kind of venture backed opportunity. And so what I mean by that is you could have the greatest idea in the world, and it could be a phenomenal idea that serves a really impactful need, right? But if it's not one that other people are going to invest in for an eventual return, you kind of need to rethink your approach. It may be just a problem that never gets solved, right? Because just the market isn't large enough. And so I think you first kind of need to understand, first come to a really kind of strong conclusion around that particular topic, because most of these startup ventures they're long roads, right? They're 7 to 10 years, and they are going to typically require a fair amount of capital up front. And so making sure that you don't get too locked into an idea, right? Knowing that, without kind of coming to this conclusion around whether or not how that idea actually is going to get to kind of the next sort of milestone. And then secondarily, kind of as a segue, I think another important point for a lot of startups is, and I mentioned this kind of at the outset of our conversation, is really kind of thinking about kind of shorter windows for your particular startup, and how do I get to the next major inflection point? How do I cross the next hurdle in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, or the next 9 months, in order to attract either more investment or other financial partners? And so that is really, really crucial. I can't stress that enough. And that also kind of parlays into my thoughts generally about getting traction as soon as possible, right? And traction could look a little bit different. I mean, if you're a digital health company that's looking for traction, right, online traction, there's probably metrics that you can point to, right, that are going to offer you a signal on whether or not you have kind of product market fit or commercial traction. In the world of venture-backed startups that are going to require the next round of capital in 12 to 24 months, that traction may look a little bit different, right? Traction could come in the kind of under the guise of feedback from customers. It could be under the guise of feedback from investors, et cetera. So looking for those kind of traction points over that next sort of 3, 6, 9 month runways is I think really, really crucial.
I have a quick question just to understand the technology, like using those like essentially waves of sound to destroy some calcification. Is it similar to how you remove kidney stones? Like
It
to what?
is. Yeah, that's where the kind of the foundation of the technology sort of stem from is extracorporeal lithotripsy, right? Which is using shock waves kind of outside the body, sending those through the tissue to break up kidney stones. Yep. And so this technology is almost just reapplied right within an angioplasty balloon for intravascular applications.
And if this is something you can talk about, what have you been able to accomplish? Like you have this idea, you want to do this. Like, okay, you are able to kind of frame this idea. Did you have to build some kind of a prototype? Did you have to show anything to investors? And what were you able to accomplish since 2021 to get to this point when you want to scale to the next level? And what does the next step look like? And how do you get to like an FDA approved or procedure that can be used by all practitioners?
Yeah, so we're not unlike most medical device startups in the sense that there's early development work, right? That involves kind of going from idea on the napkin or maybe even a prototype to eventual alpha version to a beta version, et cetera. So there's these kind of classic kind of development milestones that lead into typical preclinical efforts, right? So demonstrating that your typically hardware kind of based device is not only safe, but it's also efficacious. So that could be in an animal lab, that could be in a cadaver lab, et cetera. So there's going to be some kind of preclinical work that further kind of de-risks the project or the company that you're working on. And then next phase is really how does that ladder up to your overarching kind of clinical or regulatory path, right? Because most of these products or solutions are going to need regulatory approval. Hopefully most of the time it's a 510(k) clearance versus a full class 3 kind of PMA approval. But then that would be the next phase, right? Is how do you navigate that path and get to an eventual IDE approval to actually commence the particular study or trial that's going to be required for eventual regulatory approval. So there's all of these kind of steps or milestones or achievements, and I think how I mentioned earlier from a startup's perspective is you need to be thinking about these next milestones, these next inflection points, kind of over in 3, 6, 9 months, right? Kind of time where how do you get to there with as little of capital as possible and as quickly as possible, right? To further de-risk outside investment. Whether that's from traditional VCs, whether it's from hospital systems, whether it's from directly from maybe even physicians, as an example. So I think that's really crucial. And for Fast, as it pertains to FastWave, I think we've done a pretty good job of getting to those next major inflection points quickly, which is what we're optimizing for is speed, more so than even capital, as an example. And so, and I think we've been able to demonstrate that. I mean, the company was only formed in early 21. 21. And we've already received multiple non-provisional patents from the USPTO. We've made significant efforts, during kind of the development and early preclinical work, and now are in the process of prepping for pivotal trials that are needed for FDA clearance and approval.
Very cool. Thank you for clarifying the journey. I'm still learning the complexities of it as a kind of a little bit of an outsider. So we work with companies like yours, but we are not like essentially a medtech company. But a question I have that is based a little bit on the work that we do at Kepler team, the software, is kind of to get your perspective on the role of software for medtech startups. We have a hypothesis that medtech startups might not really consider the software so integral that they have to own it, and they might outsource it to external vendors. So could you talk a little bit about like software that you have at FastWave Medical? Is it something that you need or use? And then what's your thinking on like building the software when you are essentially a medical device company?
Yeah, so as a medical device company, and we're evaluating software that's needed, right, or is crucial kind of to part of our overarching journey. Most of that we're never going to attempt to build internally at all whatsoever. So we would always look for either an external provider, or if it's something that's totally custom, we would obviously look to sort of outside consultants or freelancers or an agency, right, to help build that for us. And I think that actually applies to even hardware, right? Even our core kind of devices that we're building, we're typically not going to scale up a huge team internally, right? Because that really constrains you, in terms of being able to kind of to pivot and ebb and flow with the natural ups and downs of a startup. And so if you can partner with the right sort of external team, whether it's a group of consultants, freelancers, or an agency, or a business that does software development in your case, I think I would encourage most people to kind of go down that path, unless it's an absolute critical key internal kind of function of your company that's absolutely needed and is going to be needed for quite some time. Then I think you may want to take a step back and think about that a little bit differently. But outsourcing with the right partners and vendors, I think, is crucial for any early stage company.
So for FastWave Medical, as you are now, is software a piece of the work that you're doing, or is it something that will come in at a later phase?
No, it is. It is. Our systems they're energy-based systems, and the generators that we are developing require software, for sure. And it's sort of part of the overarching kind of 6601 guidance that FDA provides around incorporating software into medical devices. And so it's crucial, for us, it's crucial that the CDMO partners that we're working with to develop our hardware generators, right, that they also have competency around the software too. Because if it forces us to kind of go look for an external software provider and loop one more sort of party into the equation, that presents some additional complexity, right? So from our perspective, we're looking for hardware developers or hardware partners that actually have that core competency in-house.
And was it difficult or easy to find the partner that you currently have?
Well, again, our hardware partners have that software kind of competency in-house, but I would say it was probably a little bit more difficult than you think. Most people think outsourcing to vendors is a dime a dozen, and I don't think that's the case, right? The good partners are typically pretty booked, right, and may not have a lot of availability, and so I think it was more challenging than maybe otherwise expected.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. So as we were talking about FastWave Medical, you mentioned that you are in fundraising phase. Could you talk a little bit about this opportunity for potential investors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up because we're just commencing our Series B fundraise, and so not for the faint of heart, right? Considering as you get to the next sort of phase of capital raising, it never gets easy, and what you're typically asking for is much greater, right? And so in our case, my pitch to potential investors is largely around not only the market, right? But more so how do we stack up versus other startups kind of that are approaching the same, that are operating in the same space. And so for the former, in terms of the market, the only incumbent in the space that offers intravascular lithotripsy technology is a company called FastWave Medical, which is publicly traded. Their market cap has kind of ranged between $7 and $10 billion over the past year or so. And so, we've got a unique opportunity to develop and commercialize technology in a very large market with only one competitor, one incumbent. And so that's really rare in MedTech, really rare opportunity. And then as it pertains to FastWave versus maybe other startups in the space is, I think we can easily point to our speed of execution, right? The company was just formed in early 21, have raised close to $20 million in capital in a pretty short amount of time, and have been able to demonstrate really strong progress. And so speed of execution in a market like this is pretty crucial because we don't want to attract investment ultimately to become the fourth, fifth, sixth player in the space, right? It's on us to move really quickly. That's what we're trying to optimize for. So, in summary, very large market with only one incumbent, and as a team at FastWave Medical, we're moving very quickly.
Is there a specific type of investors that you are targeting? For example, I've just read, I think today, that a lot of startups are preferring health systems and the venture arms to be a partner because it gives more opportunity for like exploration and kind of application of technology. Do you have this preference, or you are essentially agnostic towards where the funding is going to come from?
I would say, generally speaking, we're fairly agnostic, and I think that's actually worked in our favor. And we've been sort of agnostic from the very early stages. So as an example, most startups when they're just kind of getting their thing off of the starting blocks, or their venture or whatever they're working on, kind of out of the starting blocks, they'll typically try to approach high net worth individuals, angels, maybe try to partner with incubators or accelerators. We took a little bit of a different approach in the sense that a lot of that early capital we provided a lot of that early capital and resources, so that was a bit of an advantage for us. But during our Series A round of financing, we went pretty far and wide. So of course we targeted traditional venture capital firms that invest at that particular stage. But we also had a lot of conversations with strategics, right? In our case, it was strategic medical device companies. But I think we didn't for our Series A anyway, we didn't necessarily target health systems, but I don't think that's a bad approach, right? Depending on kind of what you're working on, because a lot of major health systems do have some sort of venture kind of function internally, and I think it makes a lot of sense that if you can kind of kill two birds with one stone, in the sense that you can get sort of an infusion of capital right from that particular stakeholder. But because they're going to have some skin in the game, they're going to be naturally incentivized to help you, right? So if you can accomplish that, that's a huge win versus just simply relying on traditional VC.
So let's talk a little bit about MedCider. What inspired this project? You mentioned that it started about 15 years ago. Could you talk a little bit about this initiative and your journey with it?
Yeah. So MedCider, even though we haven't touched on it in great detail, it's been a total side project of mine, really, for the better part of 15 years. And for those that are listening that aren't familiar, MedCider is largely a kind of, it's best to think about it as a kind of a podcast first sort of media site. But in essence, I interview founders and CEOs. Most of them are in traditional MedTech. Some of them are in digital health and biotech, but I interview kind of seed to Series C founders and CEOs of other startups with the entire goal of learning from them and hopefully passing along a lot of insights for listeners. And so it's a podcast that I've hosted for almost 15 years now. Bit of an OG in the world of podcasts. When I first started, I think I had a lot less gray in my sideburns, but yeah, started recording interviews, gosh, back in think 2009, 2010 timeframe, but there wasn't anything specific to MedTech. There wasn't a how I built this for, for medical devices or MedTech. And I thought I oftentimes see a lot of really cool new devices, new technologies, et cetera, in cath labs, ORs, et cetera, but I had no idea where they came from. Like, what's the origin story of these projects? How did this device that this doctor is using for a clinical trial, how did it come to be? And no one was like, recording podcasts or creating content around that at the time. And so I thought, why not? Why don't I just do it, right? And so that's sort of the origin story for MedCider, and I've kind of kept at it for quite some time now.
I appreciate you sharing what inspired you, and I like this idea of kind of optimizing your windshield time. And also, like 15 years, it's quite a commitment. I've been doing this for less than a year, and my goal has been always like to build my network and to connect with people I'm talking on the podcast. Is it something that you found to be of value, or what's the biggest value for yourself in terms of like, is it learning, is it network, is it connections in the industry and to potential investors, is it a combination? So 15 years sounds like a lot of time.
Yeah, and I haven't been. I mean, I right now I probably produce or just record and produce about an episode a week, which is a decent kind of number for me personally. But that hasn't always been the case, right? My content kind of production has ebbed and flowed over the years based on kind of what I'm doing or how much is on my plate, et cetera. But I would say selfishly, yes, it's a tremendous. It's one of the reasons I keep doing it even to this day. Is it's a phenomenal way to not only meet a lot of really interesting people that are much wiser than me, but I also, it gives me an hour to, kind of pick their brain and learn a lot about their experiences, and while also building kind of my personal network too, which especially with what I'm doing now with a lot of early stage work is really crucial, right? To be able to tap into a pretty extensive network, not just for investment, but also for looking for the right consultants or freelancers, or trying to solve for a particular need. It can be really impactful to have a strong network at this point in my career.
Very cool. So could you share 3 lessons that you've learned from doing this over the last 15 years?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, right? One is that I think, again, as any sort of startup needs to look for product market fit as early as possible. And it depends on kind of what you're working on, right? If you're working on a digital health company that's largely software rooted, it may be easier to find signals that are a little bit more clear cut in terms of who's going to pay for this, how much are they willing to pay, et cetera. But for a capital intense business that's going to, it's going to take years to eventually get to commercialization, there's other ways of finding kind of product market fit or traction. And you can do that through voice of customer. And when I say voice of customer, making sure that you're doing that with all of the different stakeholders, whether your end user is a physician, whether it's a payer or provider, right, an insurance company, whether it's a healthcare system, et cetera, making sure that you're looking for really strong signals around kind of even in the earliest phases, but with the end goal being, do I have product market fit, right? Where is this really going to resonate, if at all, right? So I think that's one really crucial thing. Another major lesson I've learned over the kind of in talking to a lot of again founders and CEOs that are kind of in that C to Series C kind of range. They have a lot of experience raising capital for their ventures, and that's arguably probably one of the biggest challenges I think for any founder or CEO is just making sure that you can keep enough money in the bank to keep to survive and advance, as I mentioned previously. Really key thing that's kind of stuck out over the years of having these interviews with various founders and CEOs. And then probably the third one, which I kind of mentioned earlier, but I can't emphasize it enough because I see a lot of really different ideas, right, that come across my kind of my inbox, so to speak. And some of them are really good, right? But it's always hard to tell, someone that spent, maybe months or years thinking about their idea, right? And at the end of the day, it's just not a venture-backed idea, right? And like I mentioned earlier, most startups in the healthcare world are going to require a fair amount of capital, right? Some more than others, but especially in MedTech. If your idea is just not a venture-backed sort of idea, you need to think about that differently. And it may not even be worth spending a lot of time on, because it's just not, there's no realistic way of raising, millions, tens of millions of dollars for your idea. And so I just think, again, I can't stress that enough. You don't want to spend, years working on an idea that eventually just is not going to have any sort of, legs to get to the finish line.
Thank you for sharing those insights. I wanted to come back a little bit to your startup journey because FastWave Medical is not your first rodeo. So you've done it before. And in preparation for this recording, we talked about your venture in consumer-driven healthcare, Juve. So could you talk a little bit about your experience with Juve and what were the key lessons you learned from that experience?
I've spent, as I kind of touched on earlier, I spent most of my career in traditional med tech, and most of it really being in the cardiovascular space. But Juve is completely different, right? Juve is we designed and developed photobiomodulation devices, or most people know it as light therapy devices. We commercialize them direct to consumer, right, through an e-commerce platform. So very, very different, right, than traditional kind of med tech. Now the design and development of those devices, there's definitely some more similarities, but the kind of the commercialization path was quite atypical. And so yeah, that was a phenomenal learning experience, and I think it's fun to touch on because it's a classic startup story. I mean, in mid 2015, not mid, kind of more late 2015, we were living in Minneapolis at the time. And kind of during the beginnings of a dearth winter, my wife purchased a red light therapy package at a local spa in Minneapolis. Really liked the therapy, but didn't like having to go to the particular kind of location, multiple times per week. And so was looking for kind of an at-home way to use the therapy. And so that's what started on the journey. And two things stood out to me early on is when we kind of were evaluating whether or not it would work, right? Is this something worth spending time on? Is one, there was a lot of science to support the therapy, right? When you tried to find that science and piecemeal it together, there weren't any brands making it easy for the end user. And so that was kind of a clear gap from my perspective, is it's like a lot of good science to support it, but yet no one's really talking about it. And then secondarily, there was no products that were meant to kind of be, used at home, especially full body products. And so seemed like a decent market, but I think what was crucial for us is like, trying to get to product market fit as fast as possible, to make a decision on, is this really a thing we're spending time on? Does this have some semblance of traction or not, right? And so, we were able to identify a manufacturer pretty quickly, make some relatively minor kind of modifications, and launch the devices pretty rapidly, right? I think our initial launch was in February of 16. So, within roughly about 6 months or so, we went from kind of tweaking a sort of an off-the-shelf kind of device, modifying it, and launching. And granted, that space, the barrier to entry from a development standpoint is a lot lower, but still, the end goal being, will someone buy this, right? That was the key question, is like, will someone, is there an audience that will buy this? And sure enough, as we kept plodding along, that became more and more true, right? Over time, and eventually scaled that company, within a couple years to over $20 million in top line revenue on an annual basis. And I think red light therapy since then has become quite popular, right? It's very easy to find on Instagram. If you do a simple Google search for red light therapy, there's endless results. And so I think we had a large part in kind of developing that market too.
So I'm just curious, as a founder, like, is it something that you like doing? You come early, you make something like from nothing to something, and then you on to the next venture, or there are other factors that play into those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a little bit more my personality, in the sense that I tend to get bored with something, after maybe a handful of years or so. So I kind of really like building something, and being very operationally involved, getting it out of the starting blocks, kind of going from 0 to 1. Arguably, that's typically really hard to do, but it's also really enjoyable for me personally.
I wanted to push you a little bit on the lessons learned and how they apply to you, in terms of, was there anything you strongly believed in or were doing, in terms of like in your entrepreneurial journey, that you changed based on the lessons you've learned?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really important to address too. So I think if you asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said, well, any startup, right? If you can just make a startup work, that's great, right? You can sort of there's probably a lot of people listening that are in a sort of a corporate kind of W-2 type of job, right? And they just want to get to a startup and kind of experience the freedom of that, kind of the fast pace, et cetera, everything that kind of everyone sort of generally speaking kind of understands about being involved in a startup. But I would say there's a certain amount of truth to that, right? But startups are incredibly hard. And that's probably a big lesson for me personally, is that it's extremely hard. Even with a successful startup, right? Just to get to the next kind of, again, the next inflection point, the next major milestone, it's really, really hard. So that's probably the first thing I would say. And then secondarily, and it kind of coincides with that, with my kind of the first part of that answer is, just because a startup is successful, it may not be, the greatest fit for you. So like, as an example, one of the reasons I personally kind of decided to operationally step away from Druve, which is a company that I built, that had a lot of I would say led a lot of that effort, right, to kind of create one of the leading categories in the space, was I was looking for me personally. I was looking to position the company for an eventual exit, a liquidity event, whereas I couldn't ultimately get buy-in across the rest of the board to position the company in that sort of fashion. And so just understanding, right, the team that's building this company, right, are yours, generally speaking, aligned around what this should look like in the event that we're successful, right? So I think that's really crucial, right? And I don't think you want to get stuck on that too early, but once there's sort of signs of success, making sure that you really do have good alignment, kind of at that founding team level, around what success looks like if we continue to have it, I think is really, really important to kind of understand early on.
And I wanted to ask about this alignment with not just the team, but other stakeholders that you might have. For example, advisors who are supporting the company, as well as community. To what extent do those stakeholders, did they play in your journey with Juve and FastWave Medical? And what role do you see for them, for you personally?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to alignment, the one caution is that when you have kind of a broad base of stakeholders, you can't please everyone. I mean, that's just impossible. And if you can't kind of if you can't sort of filter a lot of the noise, that's going to be an extremely difficult road to follow. So there's a certain amount of like sort of fundamentally believing in what you're building and the direction you're headed, right? Not to say that you're going to not listen to feedback, but some of it may be really beneficial feedback. Other feedback, it might just be noise, right? So that all of that said, I do think alignment with your kind of your core stakeholders, right, is crucial. So that could be at the board level, that could be company to investor, right? So like, as an example, in the world of like traditional med tech, if you get an investor on early, say a Series A investor, right, that owns a significant has a significant equity position in your company, and they really want to position your venture for an eventual IPO. Well, that is a really, really long road to haul, versus maybe another investor that's like, no, we should we should keep the capital in as minimal as possible, with the goal that we can exit to a strategic for a lower price point, as an example, right? So those are two very different worlds.
I like it. And to me, it aligns with the idea of leadership. As a founder, you are essentially leading and you are projecting vision, and like you have to stay true to your north, and other people are supporting your vision as long as you are the founder and the CEO. Otherwise,
Right.
it's like unfocused. My last question for you is about a specific recent book that you've read that has like influenced your decision or your thinking about something. Could you share the book that it was?
Yeah, I would say Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, if you haven't read it, is phenomenal. And I think that's quite quite popular. That's probably the more recent book, but the one that probably had a little bit more impact earlier on in my career, and it's not necessarily recent per se, but it speaks to kind of a lot of the kind of the topics that we touched on, is Traction, a book called Traction. If I had to summarize that in like 1 or 2 sentences, it's about trying to find signals in your business as early as possible to help you make the decision: is this worth kind of continuing? do we need to pivot or like move on to a different idea, right? And so I think that's really, really crucial for any startup is looking for those important signals as early as possible, as fast as possible, with with as little money as possible.
Thank you so much, Scott, for sharing your insights and your journey, and good luck with your fundraise.
Yeah, thank you very much, Igor. Appreciate you having me on.